What's empty?
All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to get started here in the next few minutes. So if you need to sign in or grab anything else from the table, coffee, pens, or any other napkins out here on the table, let's do that in the next few minutes. Let's say the next 5 minutes. Thank you. All right, I think we're good to get started. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. Good evening. My name is Pablo Carvajal. I am an activist and manager at the Institute for Justice. The Institute for Justice is a public interest civil liberties law firm that is dedicated to protecting private property rights across the U.S. We have a long history in helping property owners across the U.S. Defeat over 68 projects. We've saved nearly 20,000 homes and businesses from flawed blight designations and condemnation and from eminent domain. So we've got I apologize for this microphone, it's not working. Let me borrow this one. I think that one works better. There we go. All right, can you hear me now? Okay. So we've got a long history defending private property rights. In the past year, we've been very happy working with Stand with Southern Garfield here in Garfield, helping residents fight eminent domain abuse. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar as to what's been going on here in the city, I'll give you a brief overview for you guys to be up to speed with that. So last year, about a week before Christmas, the city created a condemnation redevelopment zone. Now, this basically would allow the city to later be able to condemn any number of the 27 properties that were identified in that study for private development. Okay. Since then, we've had several property owners, those that are impacted by that study, by that designation, come together and they challenge the city in court. So that's currently underway here as we speak. Unfortunately, though, the city has its eyes on other areas in Garfield that we feel could also be affected by a similar designation. So that's why we wanted to get everyone together here in the forum to inform you guys of what's been happening, and then also let you know how can you come together to fight any further abuses of eminent domain as a community. So that's why we're very, very happy that you are here. We do have a panel tonight that will help us understand what exactly is eminent domain. That's the name of our forum. And they'll also share some tidbits of history, of their history here. We have, in our panel, we have Lewis, who is a longtime property owner here in Garfield. We also have Malad, who is an attorney at the Institute for Justice. So thank you guys for coming and joining us tonight and sharing information with the audience. So the way that I'll get started is I'll let them introduce themselves briefly, and then give you guys an overview of not only what eminent domain is, but also as it relates to Garfield and New Jersey. And then Lewis will also go into his history in Garfield, along with sharing information as to why it's so important that you guys are here tonight. So we'll open up with introduction and a little overview with you, Malad. Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks for the introduction, Pablo. My name is Malad Imam. I'm an attorney with the Institute for Justice. I'm here to give you guys a little bit of legal background on eminent domain, especially here, eminent domain background as it pertains to New Jersey. I'm sure many of you are wondering how it's possible in the United States of America for the government to be able to take people's homes and to take businesses like Lewis's and hand them over to a developer. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about how we got to this point, how eminent domain abuse kind of exploded nationally, and then I'll talk about eminent domain in New Jersey specifically and what people can expect if they find themselves in Lewis's shoes one day. So, turning to how we got to this point, the traditional understanding of the traditional uses of eminent domain were pretty limited. So the US Constitution says private property can only be taken for public use. And most state constitutions, including New Jersey's, say the same thing. Public use traditionally meant things that the public actually uses. So eminent domain could be used for things like bridges and highways and canals, things that were actual public uses. What public uses did not mean traditionally were transfers from one private property owner to another private property owner. That would be eminent domain for private use, not public use, so it was traditionally unconstitutional. Property rights started waning over time, and one bad case for fans of property rights was a case Berman versus Parker in the 1950s. In the 1950s, we started seeing so-called urban renewal, and what urban renewal was municipalities' attempts to get rid of properties and people they didn't like. It was often used against minority groups like African Americans, and this Supreme Court case, Berman versus Parker, blessed the practice. The District of Columbia used eminent domain to take entire neighborhoods because they were supposedly subpar or unsafe or bad neighborhoods. And the plaintiff in that case, Berman, he owned a supermarket. And he said, oh, hey, my property's perfectly fine. How can you take my place? And the Supreme Court said, because you are in a blighted area, eminent domain to take your place would satisfy a public use because blight remediation is a public use. So that case was bad enough, but fast forward 50 years to 2005 and things get much worse. So in a case, Kelo versus New London, which as you guys will see a trailer about the case later today, and I encourage you all to see a film about the movie that'll come to Garfield in August called Little Pink House. The case Kelo New London was about the city of New London in Connecticut's attempt to take Suzette Kelo and her neighbors' homes and give them to Pfizer. Suzette Kelo, owner of the Little Pink House that's chronicled in the movie, said, hey, my house is perfectly fine, and how is taking my house and giving it to Pfizer satisfying any kind of public use? This just seems solely like private benefit, taking from me to benefit Pfizer. The Supreme Court in Kelo said the government of New London could take her house because so-called economic development was a public use. Because there would be supposedly higher tax revenue and more jobs and more economic benefits, it was, in the Supreme Court's view, constitutional to take Suzette Kelo's house and give it to Pfizer. Now, as you guys might predict, the jobs and the economic benefits never materialized after Pfizer was able to take Suzette Kelo's house. Pfizer never did anything useful with her property or her neighbor's property. And Sandra Day O'Connor, then Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, had a really good dissent in that case where she said, if Pfizer could take Suzette Kelo's house under this rationale of economic development, then any Ritz-Carlton can swoop in and take any Motel 6 because there would be some so-called economic benefit, an economic development benefit, where the city would theoretically get more tax revenue if a Motel 6 was replaced by a Ritz-Carlton. So nobody's property was safe under the rule as explained in Keeler versus New London. As you guys might guess, people were outraged after Keeler versus New London, since no one's home was no longer safe. And with the help of the Institute for Justice and its Castle Coalition, which organized people across the country, more than 40 states reformed their eminent domain laws after Keeler. The problem was these eminent domain reforms really ran the gamut of how good or bad they were. Some states did a great job of reforming their eminent domain laws, some states did a really bad job. One very common problem with these reforms is that they got rid of so-called economic development takings, but they left a gaping loophole for blight designations. So one example of a state like this was Tennessee. They changed their state law after Keeler versus New London to say economic development was not a public use in Tennessee. Therefore, Pfizer cannot come into Nashville or Memphis or whatever and take someone's home under the rationale that theoretically Pfizer could increase tax revenue and jobs and provide economic benefits in the state. Unfortunately, Tennessee's law and many other states' law had a loophole for blight designations, and the way this works is that if a neighborhood is designated as blighted, then the government can take any home within that neighborhood generally and transfer it to a private developer. So what we saw in the wake of Kelo and in the wake of these state reforms that kept this blight designation loophole is that there were a lot of pretextual blight takings. What that means, or rather there were a lot of pretextual blight designations. What that means is there were a lot of neighborhoods that were perfectly fine that were tagged as blighted so that a developer could come in and take the property in the blighted area. And that's exactly what's happened in Garfield's first ward study area where Lewis is located, and he can talk in more detail about that. But just to give you guys a little more background on the way New Jersey's law works, it's extremely stacked against property owners, and it leaves property owners like Lewis extremely at risk. And I want to talk about a few ways it does that. So one problem is that the criteria for designated area as blighted are very vague. There's 8 factors, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'm just going to read through one. The generality of buildings are substandard, unsafe, unsanitary, dilapidated, or obsolescent. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean for a property to be substandard? Now, Lewis can talk at length about what his property's like, but in the estimation of Garfield, his property was blighted. And I'm sure Lewis would disagree with that. I'm sure Lewis would be able to present very good evidence that it was not blighted. But in spite of that, it was very easy for the city to get a blight designation. And the reason it was easy is because the blight study that it commissioned, the first step to doing any blight designation, one of the first steps, is commissioning a study to tag the area as blighted, to say that the properties in the area are in some way substandard or not good enough. This study was funded by the city. This study had a preordained conclusion that the author of the study clearly knew we have to come back with the conclusion that this area is blighted, regardless of what the truth is, right? And to reach that conclusion, the author of the study and the city used a lot of bad evidence, or rather just a lack of evidence. Lewis can talk more in length about whatever evidence was presented against, whatever supposed evidence was presented against his property, but things like routine maintenance violations of fire codes were used as proof of blight, as proof of properties being supposedly unsafe. So let's say you're in Lewis's position. The city and its blight study have come back and said your property, your neighborhood is blighted. And that's one thing to emphasize. Even if your individual property is fine, if you are in an area that's blighted, you are at risk. Let's say you're in an area with 27 properties, 16 of them are fine, 11 of them are supposedly blighted. If you're one of the 16, that's fine. If you're in a blight designation area, the government can proceed with eminent domain down the road. So let's say you're someone like Lewis, You have property that you know is fine, you know it's perfectly adequate, and the government's alleged that it's blighted in some way. What can you do? Well, the legal deck is extremely stacked against you. You only have 10 days from the day you get notice. The city only has to give you 10 days notice. So imagine, put yourself in his shoes. Imagine you get a notice in the mail that says your property is dangerous, it's upstairs, whatever, you know it's not true, and you only have 10 days to hire a lawyer or get all the pictures and documents you need to go to this hearing and say, you know what, my property actually is good and not blighted. My property actually is adequate and not blighted. So what happens if you can't do that in 10 days? Well, the record is forever closed. That's the way New Jersey law works. New Jersey was rated, the Institute for Justice is a 50-state survey, a 50-state report card ranking states' eminent domain laws, and New Jersey was tied for worst. It got an F grade from the Institute for Justice for its eminent domain law being so bad. And one reason for this is that if you fail, if you for whatever understandable reason can't present evidence in a 10-day time block, the record is forever closed. If Lewis was not able if Lewis and his neighbors were not able to bring evidence that their neighborhood was fine at this public hearing, and the government proceeded with eminent domain 2 years down the road, if they had good evidence 2 years down the road, they wouldn't be able to present it then, because the record was closed. So that's bad enough. But then on top of that, once the city proceeds at that hearing and then proceeds next to tag a neighborhood as blighted and gets a blight designation, then you only have 45 days to challenge a blight designation. The way Garfield went about this is that they tagged the first word study area blighted immediately before Christmas. And I want Lewis to talk more at length about this so he can put you guys in his shoes, but imagine it's like 5 days before Christmas and you figure out that you have 45 days to go find an expensive lawyer and on behalf of your entire neighborhood, challenge the government's allegations that it's blighted. And if you fail to do so within those 45 days, then you're forever out of luck. If 2 years later the government comes back and says it wants to pursue eminent domain against you, because there's that original blight designation, if you didn't challenge it in 45 days, you are out of it. So, as you guys can see, with all of these kinds of procedural kind of weaknesses in New Jersey's law, the deck's extremely stacked against property owners, and it's really easy for cities like Garfield to do pretextual blight designations where they tag a perfectly adequate neighborhood blighted so they can give the property in that neighborhood to a developer. So with that intro out of the way, I want to hand it off to Lewis.
Thank you a lot.
Okay, my name is Louis Newman, and my partner Abe Levine is here. And we own a business property. We've been here since 1992. My father started a zipper manufacturing business in a New York City rented loft toward the end of World War II. He never wanted to buy real estate, probably because in Eastern Europe, every time a group of bullies wanted to take away the physical property, they just did it. And whenever Jews had to leave their homes because of persecution, everything they couldn't carry with them had to be left behind. When my parents fled Austria at the beginning of World War II, my father had to leave his business behind. Although my dad was happy to never own a business location in New York, every time his lease ran out, he had to move. And as the business grew, the moves became more difficult and more expensive. When my dad passed away, my business partner, Abe Levine, and I decided to buy a building so we would never have to move again. We had learned in school about the use of eminent domain by governments, but we had never known anyone who had been involved in this rare procedure. We found our permanent location when we purchased our building in Garfield. It had been on the market for 3 years because of its terrible condition. We spent months of effort, hundreds of extra hours of work, and hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating the insides and the outsides of the buildings. Our neighbors told us often how happy they were that we had fixed up the buildings, and we were very happy with our buildings, our location, the city, and especially our neighbors. And some of our neighbors were employed by us during these years. Also, on occasion, we have opened our parking lot for public needs. such as temporary storage of construction equipment being used at the nearby elementary school, also as a place for overflow parking for parents on meeting days, and also as an area for Garfield Public Works to dump snow during cleanup after winter storms. We thought that as long as we paid our taxes and behaved as good citizens, we would stay in our new home. Then one day, a registered letter appeared in our mailbox. It told us that the city planned to take our property using the power of eminent domain. We learned that the planned usage was an upscale private development. We really didn't understand how that could be possible in this country. Was I destined to relive the experience that my dad had in Austria and have my property taken away? Last week, when Joan Vanez and her husband Mike and I were walking through Passaic Street to tell shop owners about this forum, we came upon one owner who said that when we first came to see him last year, he didn't believe that what we told him about the city's intention to seize properties could be true. He thought that such a thing would be impossible in the United States. But now that he's been reading about all this in the newspapers, he understands that what we told